message that ended us was not a confession. It was not lipstick on a collar or perfume that didn't belong to me, or some cinematic mistake dramatic enough to make the world go still. It was a 6-digit code. A small gray notification on his phone a little after midnight, from an app no committed man should need, arriving while he was in the shower and I was sitting on the edge of his bed, deciding whether I wanted tea. For a second, I honestly thought it belonged to an old account. Some forgotten relic from before me. Some harmless digital ghost. People who are loved properly get very creative when they are trying to keep love alive 1 minute longer. But the timestamp was fresh, the phone was unlocked, and the room still looked like the beginning of a life. His shoes were by the door because he had just moved into the city that week. There were folded shirts half out of a suitcase, a grocery receipt on the dresser, my hair clip on the nightstand. The cheap white takeout containers I had brought over when I came to surprise him after work were stacked in the trash with the lids balanced badly on top. Everything in that room said beginning. The code said overlap. I did not become the kind of woman who checks phones on purpose. At least not all at once. I became her in pieces. In tiny, humiliating increments. In the slow way people become suspicious when reassurance keeps arriving with a strange aftertaste. When I met Adrian, I had just come out of a relationship long enough to leave an outline around my life. Not the kind that ends with one giant betrayal you can point to cleanly, but the kind that erodes you through postponement. Years of almosts. Years of explaining yourself into smaller and smaller versions. By the time it ended, I did not want rescue. I wanted air. So when I started dating again, I was honest in a way some people find rude. If I was having coffee with someone, I said so. If I wasn't ready to call anything exclusive, I said that too. I did not sell forever to people I had known for 11 days, just because the apps trained us all to confuse speed with sincerity. Adrian seemed to admire that. That is what I told myself later, anyway. He said my honesty was refreshing. He said he liked that I was direct. He said he had no interest in games. When I mentioned that I was still talking casually to one other person at the very beginning, he shrugged and said that was normal. We barely knew each other then. Nothing had been promised. Nothing had been violated. And because I believed adults meant what they said, I accepted his calm face as evidence. What I did not understand yet was that some people agree to a truth only so they can invoice you for it later. We met in winter, one of those gray months when every restaurant window looks warmer than your own apartment and everyone on dating apps sounds briefly more sincere. Because the cold makes loneliness feel expensive. He was funny without acting trained. He remembered things I said in ways that felt flattering rather than strategic. He brought me soup the week I got sick. He sent voice notes instead of dry little reaction texts. When he visited, he seemed present in the old-fashioned sense, like he had actually arrived instead of placing his body near me, while the rest of him stayed elsewhere. And when I finally decided I did not want to keep talking to anyone else, I told him clearly. Not because he pressured me, because I wanted to. That distinction matters to me even now. I chose him with my whole hand open. No half-truths. No hidden branch to grab if I got bored. No backup man in a waiting room. I closed the other door because what was forming with Adrian felt worth protecting. He kissed my forehead that night, like I had given him peace. Later I would understand that some people accept devotion the same way misers accept cash. Gratefully, greedily, and with no intention of changing their own habits. The first time he brought up the other man again, I thought he was just insecure. It happened after we had already become a couple. He asked some version of the same question people ask when they want pain to stay useful. Was I more attracted to the other guy at first? Did I answer him faster? If Adrian had not tried so hard, would I have picked the other person instead? I remember laughing softly and telling him no, because the answer was no. I told him what I believed was obvious. Early-stage dating is not betrayal, and choosing someone fully should settle what came before it. He nodded. He even apologized for sounding needy. Then 2 days later he said something about not wanting to feel like a consolation prize. Then the next week he made a joke about winning me in the final round. Then a week after that he asked whether I ever thought about the other man when I was with him. Every time, I soothed. Every time, I explained. Every time, I mistook repetition for vulnerability instead of what it was becoming. Infrastructure. The thing about a grievance is that if someone tends it carefully enough, it can become a room they live in. It can excuse a mood. it can excuse withdrawal, it can excuse suspicion, and, if they are selfish enough, it can excuse permission. Adrian was finishing graduate school in another state when we started getting serious, so for a while our relationship existed between airports, FaceTimes, and future tense. It had all the intensity of distance and none of the friction of laundry. He mailed me a book once because I mentioned in passing that I had loved it in college and lost my copy in a move. He ordered dessert to my apartment on a night I had to stay late at work. He remembered the anniversary of my grandmother's death better than some cousins did. He knew how to say the right thing at the right volume. That is the kind of love that confuses people afterward. Not cruel men behaving cruelly. Tender men performing tenderness with real skill. You start to think betrayal must announce itself differently. That deception should at least look disorganized. That a liar should occasionally seem distracted while lying. But Adrian was attentive. That was part of the injury. He did not love me badly. He loved me persuasively. By spring, we were talking about practical things. Sublet dates. Neighborhoods. Whether he wanted to keep his old couch. Whether my place made sense for both of us eventually, or whether we would start somewhere new once his job stabilized. He said he wanted a future that felt calm. He said with me, everything made sense. He said he had never been this certain. And still, beneath all that, he kept rubbing his thumb over the same bruise. The other guy. The early weeks. The idea that maybe he had not been chosen first enough, fast enough, cleanly enough. At some point I started noticing that he only brought it up after moments of closeness. After a good weekend. After I said I missed him. After I mentioned looking forward to his move. As if intimacy itself reminded him that he needed leverage. As if peace in the relationship made him nervous, unless he could put one small crack back into the wall. I told myself love makes people irrational sometimes. I told myself everyone drags old fears into new rooms. I told myself patience is part of building something real. What I did not tell myself, because I had no language for it yet, was that some people never intend to let you repay a debt they invented. The week he moved to my city, I was genuinely happy. That feels important to say, because heartbreak has a way of rewriting all joy into stupidity, and I do not want to insult the version of me who believed in what she was seeing. I took off work early one afternoon, so I could help him settle in. I brought Thai food, paper towels, and the good kind of coffee he liked because his kitchen was still mostly cardboard and echo. I bought tulips from the woman outside the station because I liked the idea of arriving with flowers when someone was starting over. When he opened the door, dusty and smiling, he picked me up for a second like we were in a movie too modest to admit it was a movie. There were boxes everywhere. His framed degree leaning against the wall. A lamp, with no shade yet. A stack of books near the radiator. And us, in the middle of it, laughing about how grown-up it felt to argue over where measuring cups belonged. That night he held my wrist in bed and said, half serious, that this was the beginning of the real part. I remember touching the tendon in his hand and thinking, finally, no more departures. No more countdowns. Just a normal life, which at the time sounded like the most romantic thing in the world. A normal life. A shared grocery list. A trip in June we had been planning for weeks, Sunday mornings. Coffee in the same kitchen, little domestic proofs. Nothing flashy, just continuity. 2 days later I saw the code. The notification lit up while steam was still running under the bathroom door. I did not touch the phone right away. I stared at it the way you stare at a photograph before admitting it includes a stranger. Then I picked it up and read the app name again, not one I had ever seen on his phone before. A members-only dating app. Sleek branding. The kind people talk about like, exclusivity itself is erotic. When he came out wrapped in a towel, I asked him what it was. My voice sounded so calm that for one brief second I thought maybe I had imagined the whole problem. He glanced at the screen and gave the kind of shrug that belongs to schoolboys and politicians. No idea, he said. Probably spam. Spam. A verification code from a dating app. At midnight. In the middle of moving week. For a man who had spent months asking whether I had ever made him feel second, I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, download it. He laughed first, softly. Then he said there was no point. Then he said maybe he had made an account before we got serious and forgotten about it. Then he said he was tired, and this was crazy. Do it anyway, I said. There is a tone people use when their body realizes the truth before their heart is ready to catch up. That tone had entered the room before either of us admitted it. He downloaded the app. He entered the code. He still tried to keep talking while it loaded, as if words could blur the screen before I saw what was coming. But then the messages opened. And there it was. Not one conversation. Several. Names I did not know. Photos of women smiling from cities neither of us had ever lived in together. Flirtation so practiced it felt templated. Inside jokes he had built elsewhere, compliments that sounded suspiciously familiar. I started scrolling. Not wildly, methodically. Because a strange coldness had taken over me, and once that happens, the body becomes an archivist. It stops pleading and starts collecting. February 18th. The date hit me first because I knew it. That was the weekend he had visited and asked me to be his girlfriend. I had cried afterward in the bathroom, not because I was sad, but because I was relieved to feel something clear after so much personal static. That same date now sat above a thread where he was messaging another woman, testing a joke, commenting on her photo, starting something light and suggestive while I was in the next room thinking exclusivity meant the room itself had changed shape. I kept scrolling. March, April, May, not one mistake. Not one lapse. A corridor. A private hallway running alongside the relationship I thought I was in. Then I found the trip message. That one hurt in a new register. We had been planning a short summer getaway. Nothing extravagant, just the kind of trip couples build to celebrate surviving distance. I had sent him hotel links. He had pretended to care about sheets, neighborhood noise, train access. We had jokes about which museum I would drag him through and which dessert place he insisted we had to try. In one chat, he told another woman he wanted to take her there. Not vaguely, not someday. Specifically enough that I recognized the place from our own messages. A future I thought belonged to us had already been duplicated and offered elsewhere. But the worst line was dated the day he arrived in the city. The day I brought tulips. The day I stood in his half-unpacked apartment with takeout and coffee and all my ordinary hope. In that message, he told a woman he had just landed and wanted to fly her out once he got settled. I had been in his apartment that evening. Maybe even while he typed it. Maybe while I was rinsing chopsticks in his sink. Maybe while I was smoothing the quilt on the bed. Because some old training in me still treats comfort as labor. There are betrayals that injure you, and betrayals that rearrange the furniture of memory so every good moment starts hiding a trap door. This was the second kind. I remember putting the phone down carefully. Very carefully. As if sudden movement might make me shatter before I had asked the question that now stood between us. How long? He sat at the foot of the bed, elbows on knees, towel now replaced by sweatpants, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked less like a man and more like an excuse searching for a face. He said it wasn't what it looked like. Then, seeing how useless that sounded, he changed strategies and said he had been angry for a long time. Angry about what? I asked. Though I knew. Of course I knew. He had been rehearsing the answer for months. You made me feel like a second choice from the beginning, he said. You were talking to someone else. You kept your options open. I never really got over that. There it was. The invoice. Presented at last. With interest. I said, we were not exclusive then. He said, I know, but it messed with my head. I said, so you cheated on me for months after I chose you? He said he had not met any of them in person. Not really. Not in the way that counts. As though fidelity could be litigated by mileage. He said the messages made him feel in control. He said part of him wanted to prove he would never be the vulnerable one again. He said he resented how easy it seemed for me to have options, and how hard he had worked to feel secure. That was when I understood something humiliating and clarifying all at once. He had not been seeking reassurance every time he mentioned the other guy. He had been maintaining his moral alibi. If he kept the old wound alive loudly enough, then anything he did in its shadow could feel to him like symmetry. Not betrayal. Balance. Not dishonesty. Correction. Not cheating. Compensation. A relationship cannot survive inside someone else's private court system. There is no safety there, because the verdict is always waiting for a reason to justify itself. I asked him the question I already hated myself for asking. Would this have stopped if I hadn't found it? He was quiet. Not ashamed, quiet. Calculating quiet. The kind of silence that is still deciding whether honesty is useful. Then he said, eventually, probably not. Probably not. I think that was the real ending. Not the app. Not the trip message, not even the invitation to another woman on moving day. It was hearing him admit, in the most tired voice imaginable, that he had planned to continue living in two realities for as long as I kept believing in one. People say heartbreak feels like a crack. Mine felt more administrative, like a file being moved from one drawer to another, like my body quietly changing the label from love to evidence. I stood up and started gathering my things. Not dramatically, not with thrown shoes or screaming or the satisfying violence movies teach us to admire. I picked up my charger, my toiletry bag, the sweater I had left over the chair, the tulips absurdly, because they were mine, and because I suddenly could not stand the thought of anything tender remaining in that room on my behalf. He followed me into the kitchen, asking whether we could talk when I was calmer. I remember turning around and almost laughing. Calmer. As if calm were the issue, as if composure and truth had any relationship at all. I told him the cruelest people are not always loud. Sometimes they are simply organized. Sometimes they send good morning texts and remember your coffee order and still maintain a second life with the discipline of a consultant. Sometimes they insist they are wounded while actively expanding the wound in someone else. He said he did love me. And the worst part is, I think in his own crooked way he probably believed that. But love that needs secret exemptions is just appetite with nicer handwriting. Outside, the air felt too mild for what had happened. That offended me. I wanted weather to acknowledge me. I wanted sirens. I wanted one bird to fly directly into a street lamp. Instead, the city behaved like cities do. Indifferent, electric, full of strangers carrying groceries. I called my friend Lena from the curb and asked if I could come over. She said yes before I finished the sentence. On the train, I kept replaying the messages in fragments. The code. The date. The trip. The invitation. The way he said probably not. And under all of it, something quieter and harder. All the times he had needed me to reassure him that he was chosen. All the times he had looked almost hurt and let me gather him back into certainty. All the times he had reached for comfort with hands that were already busy elsewhere. At Lena's apartment, I sat on the floor instead of the couch because upright furniture felt too official. She brought me water, then wine, then water again, when she saw I wasn't drinking the wine. I told her everything in the wrong order. That is how shock talks. It groups details by pain instead of chronology. The app first. Then the move. Then the other women. Then the trip. Then the old grievance. Then the answer to the question I should never have had to ask. Lena listened with the severe stillness of someone trying not to interrupt a wound while it is naming itself. When I told her he had blamed the early weeks before we were exclusive, she leaned back and said, "So he turned your honesty into his permission slip." Permission slip. That was cleaner than anything I had managed to say, and because it was clean, I trusted it. The next morning he sent a paragraph, then another, then 4 voice notes I did not play for 2 days because I already knew their genre. Remorse with self-defense braided through it, love mixed with autobiography, a plea to understand the childhood insecurity, the fear of abandonment, the humiliation of imagining I had chosen him after comparing him to someone else. But grown adults do not get to launder betrayal through backstory forever. At some point, your wound becomes your responsibility, even if it was handed to you unfairly. At some point, being afraid is no longer meaningfully different from being entitled if fear keeps producing the same harm, and you keep calling that harm understandable. When I finally listened, he was crying. Real crying, too. That made it harder, not easier, because false love is simple to leave. Genuine feeling inside bad character is what ruins your sleep. He said he hated himself. He said he had sabotaged the best thing in his life. He said every time he messaged someone else, part of him wanted to get caught because he couldn't stand the split anymore. Even that confession irritated me. Not because it was impossible, because it was still centered on his suffering. Even his guilt arrived, demanding to be witnessed like a talent. I did not answer that day, or the next. Instead, I took out the notebook, where I keep practical lists whenever my feelings get too large to carry naked. I made 2 columns, what he did, what I kept believing. Under the first, I wrote, kept reviving the same old insecurity, accepted exclusivity while building alternatives, messaged other women on the day he asked for commitment, offered our trip elsewhere, invited another woman into the week he moved here, admitted it would have continued. Under the second, I wrote, he's scared, he needs reassurance, distance is hard, once we live in the same city it will settle. He loves me, He loves me, he loves me. By the sixth repetition, the phrase looked almost childish. Not wrong, exactly, just incomplete in a way that now felt dangerous. Love by itself is one of the weakest protections people romanticize. Plenty of harmful people love intensely. Plenty of selfish people miss you terribly. Plenty of liars cry honest tears after the lie stops working. Character is what decides whether love becomes shelter or theater. A few friends asked whether I thought he had actually met any of the women. I told them it almost didn't matter. That answer surprised even me, because if you had asked me a week earlier, I would have treated physical betrayal as the bright moral line and everything else as surrounding weather. But sitting in the aftermath, what gutted me was not just what he did with his body or intended to do with it. It was the sustained architecture of permission, the months of collecting my trust while privately reserving the right to betray it, the way he trained me to respond to his insecurity like a caretaker while using that same insecurity as camouflage. That is why the comments on stories like these tend to sound so sharp. Strangers recognize manipulation faster than the person being manipulated because they are not busy loving the performance. They can see the mechanism. They can say liar while you are still saying hurt. They can say pattern while you are still saying confusion. Distance makes diagnosis easier. And yes, there were people who wanted to pin some of it on me. People who think mentioning another date before exclusivity is the same as conducting a hidden parallel relationship inside commitment. People who need women to become retroactively guilty so men can look reactively weak instead of actively dishonest. I read those comments too. For a moment they found the old tender spot in me that always wonders whether transparency can somehow become cruelty if received by a fragile enough person. But then I returned to the dates, to the message timeline, to the content, to his own answer. Would this have stopped if I hadn't found it? Probably not. There is no moral math in the world that turns that into my fault. 3 nights after I left, he came by my apartment building and texted that he was downstairs. He had my favorite bakery box in one hand and, judging from the photo he sent as proof of presence, the same face he probably wore each time he asked me whether I had ever really picked him first. I did not go down. I watched the typing bubble appear and disappear and finally settle into one sentence. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I need you to know it was always you. Always you. Alongside everyone else. Always you. Except when he needed an audience for his resentment. Always you. Except when he wanted the thrill of being desired, without the discipline of being loyal. Always you, in the way a person says they only want one home, while quietly collecting keys to others. I deleted the message. Then I cried harder than I had the night I found out. Because betrayal is rarely hardest at discovery. Discovery is electric. Discovery gives you a task. The harder grief comes later, when you start separating what was real from what was only well delivered. Did he mean it when he held my face at the station? Probably. Did he mean it when he said he had never felt this peaceful? Maybe. Did he mean it when he sent flowers to my office? Sure. Did any of that undo the second life? No, truth does not become loyal just because some of the tenderness was sincere. Weeks passed. My body returned before my pride did. I stopped checking my phone first thing in the morning. Food started tasting like food again instead of obligation. The June trip refund hit my account, and I laughed at the bureaucratic coldness of the email. Your reservation has been canceled, as if the universe had outsourced my heartbreak to customer service. Lena and I used part of the refund for one night away anyway. Small hotel. Quiet street. No romance attached. We ate expensive fries in bed and watched terrible television and let the room remain exactly what it was. No symbolism. No future tense. Just rest. One evening there, while brushing my teeth in a bathroom lit too warmly to flatter anyone, I realized I no longer wanted an explanation that made him good. That was the real shift. For a while after betrayal, your mind keeps trying to build a bridge back to the person you thought you knew. Trauma loves a neat translation. If he was scared, maybe he can still be safe. If he was ashamed, maybe he can still be worthy. If he was split, maybe the better half can return and claim the damage. But eventually, you get tired. Not of mourning, of editing, of doing unpaid interpretive labor on behalf of someone else's character. And once that fatigue arrives, freedom gets much closer. I do not think Adrian cheated because I once dated honestly before choosing him. I think he liked what that story allowed him to feel about himself. Wronged, exempt, complex, the tragic man with a bruised ego and therefore looser obligations. That role let him enjoy both positions at once. Victim and betrayer, needy and entitled, chosen and still shopping. People call that hypocrisy, which is true. But it is also laziness. Real intimacy requires a person to experience hurt without turning it into policy. To say, I am insecure, and then do the humiliating adult work of managing insecurity without outsourcing its consequences. He did not want that work. He wanted the costume of woundedness and the pleasures of disloyalty. So no, I was not mourning only a boyfriend. I was mourning how easy it is to be fooled by coherent effort. How quickly we trust people who know the correct emotional vocabulary. How often women are taught to treat jealousy as depth, suspicion as proof of investment, repeated questioning as vulnerability, and explanation as intimacy. Sometimes the person insisting they are afraid of losing you is simply telling you, in a prettier dialect, that they believe their fear entitles them to special behavior. If I tell this story now, I do not tell it as a warning against dating after heartbreak, or against honesty, or against long distance, or against men who have been hurt before. Those are too broad, too lazy, too clean. I tell it as a warning about private permission systems, about anyone who keeps one old grievance polished to a shine, long after the relationship itself should have made it irrelevant. About anyone who needs you to keep apologizing for a chapter that ended before the book you're actually in began. Because sometimes that grievance is not unresolved pain. Sometimes it is a key. And if you are not paying attention, they will use it to unlock every room where accountability should live. The 6-digit code was not the betrayal, it was only the flashlight. The betrayal had been walking beside me for months, carrying groceries, saying goodnight, asking if I got home safe, telling me I was the best thing that had happened to him. The code simply lit the hallway. I'm grateful for that now. Not because gratitude fixes anything. Because exposure does. Because once the hallway is lit, you stop decorating the dark.
Thank you for watching. If this story pulled you in, do me one favor. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so the next one finds you the moment it drops. Remember, nothing is ever just what it seems. See you on the next one.